Professor Sahar Mohamed Khamis, thank you very much for coming down to TRT World. Professor Sahar is an associate professor of communication in the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland. She is a visiting professor in the University of Chicago and an author of plenty of books. Thank you so much. It's a privilege to have you here today.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Sure. So, as you know, we're going to talk about the student protests that have sort of swept the United States across the campus. I wanted to start by asking you, what according to you, is the current situation regarding the protests at your university, the University of Maryland, and how has the university responded to these protests thus far?
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. This is a very important moment to talk about the students' protests. It's really been an unprecedented moment since the 60s or 70s. We did not witness this kind of large-scale protests that we are witnessing now on so many campuses across the United States. We have more than 120 universities right now that have protested encampments in support of human rights, in support of the Palestinians, and against the war on Gaza. We have not witnessed this kind of wave of large-scale protests since the protests against the war on Vietnam, and of course against racial discrimination policies in the 60s and 70s. So that's why I'm saying it's a very important historical moment. As for the University of Maryland, really to their credit, they've had a very good, balanced way of dealing with this particular situation. Yes, we did have, of course, a few protests on campus. The university did not act in the oppressive way that we have witnessed in other schools and other campuses, like, for example, what happened in Columbia University when the president of Columbia University called in the police and they arrested some of the students and some of them were suspended, and that really backfired. It had a very counterproductive effect, and it led to igniting even more and more protests across many more campuses all over the United States. At the University of Maryland, to their credit, really, there has been a very balanced and even-handed approach of dealing with students, trying to keep the students safe, while at the same time allowing them to express themselves and to protect freedom of expression, academic freedom, and their ability to engage and express their own views.
Yeah, so my next question actually stems from what you just said, in that there have been different approaches. Like some universities have really had a hands-off approach, while some actually have called on the cops on their students. So how do you see this dichotomy, like, some universities like having a very rough sort of crackdown on the students and some actually placating them and listening to their students?
I always believe that violence creates more violence. It's never a good idea to use violence of any sort. Every time you try to suppress something and crush it and use violence and bring in the police and suspend students and arrest them and even arrest faculty members. Let's not forget, it's not just about students.
That's right.
We have seen students, we have seen staff, we have seen, faculty members who have been arrested, who have been beaten in front of the rolling cameras. It's just unbelievable. And whenever something like that happens, it just ignites more and more anger and more, uproar among the student body. So I believe that, in a country like the United States, it always, talks about the importance of upholding values, like values of academic freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, the ability to express yourself freely without any kind of fear of certain consequences. It's very important to allow this margin of freedom of expression and freedom of academic opinions, as long as you don't infringe on other people's rights. I want to really highlight this point. Your freedom stops when other people's freedom starts. Right? And that is the red line that everybody has to observe.
Sure. And in the way you see President Biden handling these protests, there's been a perception that, the way White House has looked at it has been rather slanted. Do you think that this is going to have an impact in the coming elections in November?
Yeah, we are now in the elections year, right? We're just a few months away from the presidential elections of November 2024. And what we have been witnessing, unfortunately, is the White House handling of the Gaza crisis has not really been working very well for the image of President Biden and his administration. There's been a lot of criticism domestically as well as globally and internationally for the way he has been handling this crisis. Then comes the student protests on so many campuses.
That's right.
And then you see him, talking about some of these protests being chaos or unrest or, creating some kind of disorder on some campuses. That doesn't fly well with many voters, especially if you are looking at the young voters, if you're looking at the youth, right? Youth, many of them are very much pro-human rights, pro-freedom,
very progressive,
Progressive, exactly, much more progressive. And therefore, when they look at this kind of rhetoric, they really don't feel very happy about it. And therefore, I believe that he's going to lose a lot of the support that can come from particularly these sectors, like, young students, youth, and so on. And not only that, but all the people who describe themselves progressive radical, describe themselves as liberals, people who are, pro-human rights, minorities, immigrants,
Right.
people of color. All of these are also gonna, possibly not give him their own vote
Right.
in the upcoming elections.
Yeah, and regarding the students' demand of divestment from Israel, do you think it's a feasible, realistic demand by the student groups?
This has been one of the important demands put forward by a number of student groups. They have a long list of demands.
Mhm.
But in brief, they've been asking basically for the students who have been arrested to be released. Those who have been suspended to return back again to their classes, especially that we are coming close to the end of the semester,
Right.
the end of the academic year, and students are, supposed to be in the classroom, taking their exams and ending their school year successfully,
Right.
rather than being arrested or detained or suspended. And one of their demands is divestment. So divestment, just to clarify this point to our viewers everywhere, is basically a demand that these students and activists and protesters are asking the different universities not to invest in certain companies or certain organizations or institutions that could support the war machine in Israel that is being used against the civilians in Gaza. That is, in a nutshell, what divestment is all about.
Right.
Now, this seems like a very high ceiling. I've been asked in some interviews before, like, oh, this is very unrealistic,
Yeah.
Well, let me tell you that in some universities, it did not go through, including my own university, University of Maryland. There was a petition put forward by the students and it did not go through. But in other universities, it did go through, like University of Southern California and also Brown University. There was actually an acceptance of the petition for divestment. So there is some kind of momentum that is now taking place, and I believe breaking some of these taboos and moving forward in this direction. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen between one day and the next day, obviously, but it's going to be a long-term process.
Yeah. Now, these protests have been going on for quite some time now. What according to you, has been accomplished till now, and what needs to be done from here?
That's a very good question. I believe that the most important achievement has been raising awareness about the plight of the Palestinian people and their suffering and what is going on in Gaza. Let me, as a professor of communication, just quickly say that mainstream media, unfortunately, has been part of the problem.
That's right.
Rather than part of the solution when it comes to Gaza. The way it has been handling the events in Gaza and the killing and the demolitions and the loss of human life and all of that stuff has not been satisfactory and has not been allowing the audiences to see what is actually happening. And that's where the role of social media came in. Social media allowed the audience to actually see what is happening in Gaza, the killing of civilians, mothers, crying and screaming, and babies losing their lives and all of that stuff. And that really impacted this particular population that we are talking about. The young protesters, the college students, the youth in general. And now they have this momentum of raising awareness. And let me tell you, it is snowballing. And it's not just snowballing inside the United States, like we talked about it reaching more than 120 universities. It's also reaching a global international impact and echo effect as well. You see universities in, for example, Canada, top universities like McGill, British Columbia, Toronto University. All of these have protests.
Or in Europe, in France, etc.
Yes, in France, in Britain, Australia. It's really becoming now a global phenomenon. And that is, in my opinion, the greatest achievement. It is raising awareness and also creating this echo snowballing effect.
That's right.
Now, what needs to be done, I believe, is keeping the pressure and keeping the momentum. I've been asked the other day, like, oh, is it gonna, fade sometime
Frizzle out,
exactly. Like, especially we're coming to the end of the academic year. A lot of students might leave the campus, travel somewhere, join their families elsewhere, and so on. So I believe it's important to create some kind of mechanism, maybe on the ground, maybe online, maybe both online and on the ground, where you keep the momentum going so it does not just fade away overnight.
Yeah. So you are an academic, and as the president of the Arab-US Association of Communication Educators, let me toss a philosophical, intellectual question to you. As an academic, how do you interpret this student activism in the US, which is now referred to as the Student Spring of the United States?
Yes.
How do you see it as an educator? Like, did you expect like these students to come out of their campuses and rather very defiantly take on the powers that be?
I didn't expect it. I didn't see it coming, to be very honest with you. And it came as a big surprise, not just for me, but for a lot of people. They did not see it coming. And to me, it was like an eye-opening moment because, for a long time, these students have been taught that, the US is a place where you have freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, academic freedom, and so on. So when they see something like what happened in Colombia, they're shocked.
Right.
Like basically, wait a minute, this is completely
It's not happening in America, yeah.
Exactly. Even some people said, if this was to happen in a country like Iran, the US government would be calling for a regime change overnight.
But obviously giving lectures, yeah.
If you see, the police beating up the protesters and beating up some of the, women and some of the faculty members and all of the horrific images we have seen in some of the footage coming out of Colombia and some of the other campuses as well.
Yeah.
So it's really a very important turning moment and learning moment, educational moment for these young students, because remember, these are students going to create the future of America and the future of the world.
They are the future leaders, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And remember that many of these universities we're talking about are Ivy League schools. That's a very important point.
Yeah.
When I say Ivy League schools, they are the top schools, the schools of the elites.
Correct.
So from these universities, you're going to have the presidents of the United States in the future. Like, for example, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush graduated from Yale.
Right.
We have seen momentum in Yale, in Harvard, in Columbia.
Right.
These are Ivy League schools.
Correct.
These schools are going to also produce and graduate the secretaries of state.
Absolutely.
They're going to also graduate the senators and congressmen and congresswomen of the future.
That's right. The diplomatic corps.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So now you are seeing that this diplomatic corps is changing to the core.
Right. That's right. Very right.
It's really changing. It is shifting. And a lot of people are saying, okay, what does that mean for America's future? What does it mean for America's foreign policy? What does it mean for American-Israeli relations? And these are very important questions to put on the table.
Right. Now, can you provide us insights into the strategies that universities can employ to navigate these protests more effectively going forward?
Yes, I have the honor and the pleasure of serving on a task force at University of Maryland, which is called the Joint Islamophobia Anti-Semitism Task Force. So unlike other campuses like Columbia that has only an anti-Semitism task force, our task force at University of Maryland is joint. It's bringing together the Jewish and the Muslim community to talk about these issues, talk about issues of freedom of expression, what are the limits, what are the boundaries. And that's a very important discussion to have.
Right.
Because every time you have conflict or tension, everybody isolates.
Right.
You turn into your own bubble. I turn into my own bubble. We are not talking to each other anymore. And that is very dangerous.
Right.
So I believe that this is a really, really important thing. I would love for this model to be emulated and echoed in other campuses, because it does diffuse a lot of the tensions and diffuse a lot of the problems once you start hearing from the other side, not only about the other side.
Right. And also, a concluding question to this, do you also suggest that the students should refine some of their messaging and tactics to maximize the impact of their protests?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for this very important question. As a professor of communication, words matter, right? The words you choose really matter. They do make an impact.
Right.
They can turn me into your enemy, or God forbid, into your enemy or into your friend. Right?
That's
so
right.
That's a very important thing to bear in mind.
Correct.
So I always tell my students, think about yourself, but also think about others, right?
Right.
For example, when you use certain language, right, make sure that your language is not, for example, critical of all Jews,
right,
or all the Jewish people, because we have seen a lot of Jewish students
are part of these protests.
Exactly, they became very active, very active in a very productive and very positive way. Groups like Jewish Voice for Peace and other organizations, they're not just participants, they're leaders and organizers of some of these students' protests, and some of them got suspended, some of them also got arrested.
Correct.
Just like the Arab and Muslim students and students from African American, Latino background,
that's right,
and all other backgrounds. So you cannot, for example, adopt a message that is against all Arabs or against all Muslims or against all Jews. Once you start to enter into this area of generalization, right, sweeping generalization, just painting everyone with a broad brush, you lose people.
That's right.
And you lose solidarity.
That's right.
And that's a very dangerous point. So choose your words,
carefully,
choose your messaging, make sure your message is very pointed, very clear, and targeted.
Right. Last question. Today we saw America finally saying that we are going to stop the arms shipment to Israel. Do you think this is probably, obviously there must be a lot of diplomacy behind it, but these student protests, do you think they have in some ways helped the policymakers shape their decisions?
I think that these protests are really creating this snowballing effect we've been talking about, or ripple effect, right? It's not going to happen overnight, but I'm really seeing some kind of momentum, which is building up slowly but surely, right?
Correct.
Especially as we're coming closer to the November 2024 elections and the potential impact that these student protests have. Remember, these are now global, as we talked about, international. The cameras are rolling. There are big stories all over the media, nationally and internationally. The world is waking up. I would describe this as an awakening.
Yeah.
It's an awakening. This is really what it is, an awareness and an awakening. And that, of course, is going to have some kind of ripple effect on American policy. Maybe it's not going to be overnight, but definitely on the long term, we're going to see this momentum and this change happening.
Professor Sahar Khamis, thank you so much for talking to TRT World.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure.